on Negri's introduction to supercommunities. The electronic journal eFlux, in collaboration with the publishing house Verso, released a book titled Supercommunity: Diabolical Togetherness Beyond Contemporary Art in 2017. To be honest, I would not have chanced upon it had I not been searching for Negri's recent work, fresh as I was from reading his Notes on Communism, Some Thoughts on Its Concept and Practice, from the Idea of Communism conference held at Birkbeck, London in 2009. A lively and suggestive introduction to his thought, which I felt did offer the possibility of reconsidering certain rather dusted structuralist reasoning, especially in its recharting of institutional affinities. Approaching Negri as a reader of Marxist traditions, a philosopher would be delighted to discover that this is a militant who actually does engage with that strange afterglow of post-structuralism we know to be Deleuze and Guattari. All the queerer to an orthodox Hegelian, given that this is an individual with some commitments to the workers' movement in Italy, who would still wholeheartedly support the strategy of strikes in an age of the self-entrepreneur, which may after all be no different from our capitalist from yesteryears that we were all impelled to be. This is an attraction, if you will, that would not be altogether strange were we to consider that often it was the workerists who resisted organized unions, all innuendos intended, including, of course, the party, that antiquated Leninist apparatus which even the Maoists were organizing something of an exodus from. Indeed, it is hard here not to introduce Negri without first prefacing the revolution in philosophy, for, counter tendencies aside, it was indeed that which Gilles Deleuze ushered into France, almost under the noses of Althusserians, Foucauldians, while seemingly still claiming a fidelity to an old teacher in Sartre. History aside, the program was changing. The Iron Curtain was not the blackboard, and history was not sexuality. Even if some capital were to be cordoned off to an accursed share to facilitate it. Let me repeat this sentence. The Iron Curtain was not the blackboard, and history was not sexuality, even if some capital were to be cordoned off to an accursed share to facilitate it. A quote may reveal to us the kind of tendency Deleuze represented among the old guard of structuralist Marxists holding fort at the time. Quote, "The struggle for modern subjectivity passes through a resistance to the two present forms of subjection, the one consisting of individualizing ourselves on the basis of the constraints of power, the other of attracting each individual to a known and recognized form of identity, fixed once and for all. The struggle for subjectivity presents itself, therefore, as the right to difference, variation, and metamorphosis." I think it's worth repeating. The struggle for modern subjectivity passes through a resistance to the two present forms of subjection, the one consisting of individualizing ourselves on the basis of the constraints of power, the other of attracting each individual to a known and recognized form of identity. This is a quote from Foucault by Gilles Deleuze. The right to metamorphosis, seemingly the molecular correlate of the right of nations to self-determination, a capacity which governments indeed would have much to say about, and we would do well to recall that Alexandre Kojève, a resident Hegelian in Paris, was a chief planner of what would come to be the European Common Market. A theme can be traced through some of these maneuvers, perhaps emblazoned by Foucault, of discipline, whether to the party line or the family, no longer being a virtue. You may of course say that the former was perhaps reflective in Sartre himself, and with the French distance from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union prefiguring as it may the rise of Eurocommunism, and that this loss of faith, as it were, is readable as an eternal recurrence, which Nietzsche once spoke about in an age where Europe itself found that it could no longer answer to the church. A declension, as it were, which Foucault does acknowledge a debt for. So what is to become of becoming, or metamorphosis, as it were? If classes are no longer able to mobilize alliances and antagonisms amongst them, or worse, if such alliances have been ossified by familial bonds, then individuals would, again, be expected to emerge into the open field, gleaning scratches, signs for the next hole to burrow in, if only to repeat disassociations from grander questions of purpose in history. Two contemporary philosophers familiar with this sequence would term this a disjunctive synthesis, and I'm referring to Leclerc and Balibar. If you notice, the Deleuzian moment of a plane of immanence, of lines of flight and spatial becomings, and their animistic correlates to forms of movement, was immanent, and a page in history says that philosophy was not the same again. The editors of the volume before our consideration are not unmoved. Quote, I convert political desires to economic flows and data, and then I convert them back again. I convert revolutions to revelations. I don't want security, I want to leave, and then disperse myself everywhere, and all the time. End of quote. Existential liberation without singularity in pure expressionism. But Antonio Negri sees, guided by the title and raised by the assemblages of an echolocated kitchen, supercommunity, not multitude, mind you, a gay science as it were for the 21st century. Damn it, I coughed historical. Fatalism, that is the enemy, and no laconic tragedy will cure this humor. Finally, and with some relief, I note that our militant does ask the squiggly question, whether this new Senate in a techno-Amazon world will stand up to or comply with a Rome that would seek no ties to a calendar. Supercommunity, however, is not the multitude. While conceding the latter's reliance on industry, even as it resists it by dragging its feet or squatting, our new concept is one which allows a snorkel hole into singularities. I eat my words. but also their consequent subjectivations. A new society of the spectacle. Anyone? But what may this super community be? Well, it is customary now to define it in terms of what it is not. That is, a monopoly, first of all. This is, or would be, a new composition of the labor movement, a hypothesis, as it were, if this word is not too Badiouian. Reaching out into the future, our militant philosopher discovers long lost roots in the German Romantic movement, and Schelling, Hegel, along with the poet Hölderlin, are invoked along with the renunciation of foul ends as myth and rationality are once more in synchrony. Not our author's strongest suit, if I may add. Yet, were I to persist, I would have to identify what to me would appear as a coincidence of the new or rediscovered pantheon, which Negri is invoking as the mythology of reason, and what a college department may refer to as the canon. What is of note from our militant who wrote of a similar subject while in prison is the time which such a traversal from a nowhere now, coagulated by materials amidst the assemblage of a power structure which barely appears to be even capitalistic, and a hypothetical future which may incidentally already have bets riding on it, is in my less poetic moment a season in hell. To quote, survival becomes less terribly brutal and more thrillingly ambiguous. The future becomes a vector for investment into the dreams of clairvoyant artists who might or might not make artworks. Artworks themselves become prey to a new class hoarding surplus information to accrue future interest. Now there are special discounts on round-trip airfares between life and death. Whether you live surrounded by the walking dead or have already arrived in the afterlife, you can travel freely back and forth and still get to work Monday morning, refreshed and ready to fight. And while thrillingly lyrical in depicting the nightmarish monstrosity that the Umwelt of proletarian subjectivity has been, does he achieve anything beyond raising a silent whisper to a looming and, dare I say, knowing spectre of conservatism? Indeed, can we not say that this is the unavowed bet which the present, nay, the life in question, seems to be devilishly insured by? Behind his back, yes, enchantingly, but also beyond his reach. Amidst our mechanic enslavement, which is perhaps more manifest in social circuitry than in any mechanism per se, we have managed to identify ourselves having lost the capacity to take a distance from oneself. Our gaze hence is a product of pastiche galleries we have been conditioned to see, amidst prefabricated confines we only look through. The past is myth, the future hypothesis, and I repeat Jameson's refrain that never has a generation had a poorer sense of historicity. Can we not but reinvent art here? We must. But now? someone should raise this question, which will have to account for where it stands vis-a-vis the narrative it appears to be banking on. Negri does put life into the notion of supercommunity at this step rather desperately. Working artists and the greater economy, wage, and global ultra-luxury faction, Gulf, are invoked as possible factions. These are organizations of collaborative artists who make certain demands regarding the working conditions of immigrants in New York and in the Emirates, are invoked as possible factions who may embody some of these convictions. The desperation of such bids is a position which Negri attests to, a courtesy which we could possibly excuse ourselves from were we to perhaps see that such movements may constitute and collaborate with that project which Knecht and Cluj refer to as a proletarian public sphere, which perhaps has more of a foothold now in universities, publications, and parties than it did when their work, Public Sphere and Experience, was first released in 1993. The courage to do what our intellect thinks to be necessary. This is the stake which any such party, even if it were to be invisible, may form. The organization of space and its capacity to facilitate new lines of flight and coalesce old ones to reveal unexplored dimensions in our common heritage is the live possibility of this artistic trench dug in 2017. Can we hold and make inroads from this line is the inquiry of our struggle. Now again I will insist here that you do read this piece and go ahead and read the entirety of the introduction to Supercommunities by Negri himself. However, what I have hoped to present to you is something of a topography of how such a movement is visible to someone who may not share the same story as Antonio Negri himself, who is a rather famed philosopher with a career that spans, of course, teaching in universities, collaborating with Ivy League institutions in America, and, of course, a history of prison sentences for terrorism. A student who may think of some of these questions would not have shared this background. And it's very important that a philosopher remembers that a argument is not reducible to any set of essential qualities inherent or represented by the person who presents them. And when you do consider the arguments themselves, you will have to bear in mind that there were simultaneously alternative movements happening in Germany. Students of Habermas, Oscar Knecht and Alexander Kluge, seeking to map the Free University movement, the Free University of Berlin, for instance, having courses designed in ways that sought to challenge the canon. You, of course, have the Workers' and Punks University in Ljubljana. And many other instances have come together in ways which this militantly workerist tendency that seeks to directly secure rights for migrants while welcoming and, of course, progressive, does in many ways willfully ignore. And while I would always invite a new claim to a history, I cannot claim that this event or this occurrence or these emergences happen in a vacuum. There is a historical tendency already at play, and there is also the counter tendency that does appear, that does reveal itself in such lights of a certain kind of piggybacking that may be happening along these lines which I have just invoked. And This is a charge. It's not the best argued charge, but it is one that will have some reflection in the earlier paper that I pointed out to by Susan Buck-Morss, where she, in many ways, she cites, and of course, Etienne Balibar explicitly presents the case of differentiating a Hegelian Marxian account from a workerist Marxism that would reject the party. And this is really a set of coordinates which would have to be uh, charted clearly within the minds of anyone who is making commitments in any of these directions. Having said that, I will leave the text in the description box. As always, I invite your suggestions, criticisms, and anything else that you may wish to throw my way. And with that, I shall bid you a good evening and thank you for your time. Bye bye.